Over the course of this semester, something that has been made clear is the need and importance of multicultural education and linguistically diverse education practices within the classroom. Because of this, amplifying student voice has been one of the main goals within this research project. In order to best serve our students of multicultural backgrounds, it is important that we recognize their voice and we affirm it, because something that happens often to these students, whether because of their language differences or cultural differences, is their voices are diminished. The guiding questions for this project included asking how the implementation of restorative justice circles in the classroom could help build stronger relationships with and among students, and how those stronger relationships within that practice would help affirm a student's voice and multicultural backgrounds. So to begin, there's some background that needs to take place involving restorative practices in the classroom and the philosophies that it came out of. Much like multicultural and linguistically diverse education, restorative practices and the restorative justice philosophy are philosophies more than set prescriptive methods for practice. And so the three main values within restorative justice philosophy include respect, dignity, and mutual concern, and they come from core beliefs that people are worthy and relational. So restorative practices find their traction in paradigm shifts. Three major concepts that are included in these paradigms are creating just and equitable learning environments, nurturing healthy relationships, and repairing harm and transforming conflict. The first and the third especially go hand in hand with multicultural and linguistically diverse education. It's important that we are creating equitable learning environments in our classrooms for these students, especially since many of them do not face equitable environments outside of our school buildings. And it's also important that we are seeking to repair harm and transform conflict in our classroom, that we give students the opportunity to disagree with civility and without attacking one another when they do have disagreements on topics and issues. But if one of the main tenets of multicultural education is going to involve discussing difficult topics in history and the world around us, if we want students to have a critical perspective of their world, we have to be willing to address these topics, and they are messy and complicated and often involve parties that have been harmed. And so something that is really important is going to be coming at those topics with the idea that we can repair that harm and transform the conflict that has been there. In order to conduct this research on the impact of restorative justice practices in the classroom, I conducted action research in my own classroom. And this choice was inspired by education work done by Shirley Bryce Heath on ethnographic schooling. In her research, she looked at different types of students that weren't being as successful as others in classrooms in the Carolinas. And she saw that the home cultures of those students was very different from what the teachers' home cultures were. And because of that, the questioning methods weren't working. And so she had the teachers become ethnographers of their students and their home lives, researching about what their community was like, how they interacted with each other, taking journals and conducting interviews. And so that's the inspiration for this research here. Because of her work, she was able to build a bridge between the community and the classroom, which is another main goal for multicultural education. Within my research, I conducted interviews through surveys of my students, and these were done on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 of their perceptions on different topics. And then I did journals of my own observations in the classroom. I was able to make comparisons between the 3 different classes this action research took place in. And as the educator and the teacher there every single day, I was able to bring in insights on the different individual cultures of those classes, their atmospheres, the student demographics as well to my journals. So I will be analyzing data from and making conclusions from both of those different sets, the surveys and my journals. To be noted that I am also acknowledging the limitations that this qualitative research has. It will not result in the most concrete empirical data, but I would also argue that the realm of education and its contemporary reform should be more concerned on the story of individual students and the teachers rather than empirical data all the time. To begin this action research in my classroom, I implemented the use of restorative circles in my classroom from the beginning of the year. These practices included the use of a talking piece, which in my classroom is a stuffed buffalo. And the way that we work with talking circles is that the person holding the talking piece is the person who holds the space and who gets to talk. If they do not have the talking piece, they shouldn't be talking, which is something I'll discuss in my journal analysis. I also provided my students with a 4A's format, just as another way to help them come up with something to share while they were in circle. They're not always required to share in circle. Sometimes it's just asking them how they're doing on a scale of 1 to 5 that day. But the 4A's include an aha moment and something amazing, an appreciation, or an apology. And it was interesting that one of the 4 that I didn't think students would use all that much, which was the apology, was one that was used more often probably than any of the others, which I think just goes to show that this provided a space where students could make things right when stuff has maybe not gone as well as it could have. The subjects for this research and study included 2 7th grade language arts classes and 1 8th grade class. These students meet with me every single day and at different times of the day. Some are meeting at the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end. I'll call them class A, B, and C for the purposes of this dissemination of data. Classes A and B are both 7th grade classes. Class C is an 8th grade class, and there is a difference in the type of topics that want to be discussed between those 2 grade levels. There's also a difference in energy levels and the type of relationship students have with each other. There are friends, there are students that do not like each other in all of these classes. The demographics for these classes in terms of race include white or Caucasian students. There are Mexican and Latino or Hispanic students as well. There's a student who is Black. There are students that have Asian ethnicities. And so that's the makeup of those 3 different classes. Ultimately, I saw that this implementation of this practice has been a positive change in my classroom overall. Students have said that they enjoy their time in circle, that they want more time in circle. It's a time where I talk less and they usually talk more because I also use the talking piece. And it's also been tied, I think, to students' overall feelings in the class. There were 2 surveys students were given about circles and class practices specifically. One was at the beginning of the year, and then another was towards the end of our semester here. And each of them had very similar questions, asking on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about circles? How do you feel in this class? What's the purpose of our circle talks? The ending survey included a question on whether they felt their voice was heard on a scale of 1 to 5, and it also included a short answer question asking how comfortable they felt sharing their culture in class. And these only appeared on the second ending survey to specifically focus in on that question of voice. At the beginning of the year, the 2 7th grade classes' perceptions of circles looked like this. Some of them had not done anything like this before in other classes. They discuss things and they know what a circle is. My last block of the day is Class B. The first block is Class A. And at the beginning, Class B had really an overall very high perspective of circles. They're also a much more energetic class at the end of the day than my Class A group. Which did have one who had a pretty low view of those circles. Towards the end, though, Class A's movement went to look much like Class B's perception at the beginning of the year and scoring in moderate to very high views on circles. Class B has much more of a mix, which I believe is due to the fact that we've been together and know a little bit more about each other. Stuff has happened, there's been conflicts, and they have a little bit of understanding, but I think it is positive that overall the perception is very high for the group as well. My eighth graders had a pretty similar look for how they felt about circles at the beginning of the year. There are a couple that had very low perceptions of it. Overall, they had high views at the beginning of the year. And now, as we've gone on, again, the majority is in the very high category. And there still are a few that have a low view of circles as well. Overall, with all of my classes, this was the before, the beginning feelings about circles, and the overall after, which does show significant growth in their perceptions of viewing it as a positive thing in our classroom, which I believe is also tied to their perception of their voice. Overall, for all of my students, they scored in the moderate to very high as a majority for how they perceive their voice was heard. Many of them do feel heard, and there are still a couple, and there will always be exceptions in the classroom. These are the results for their overall opinions in the class of how they feel. In my own journal conclusions, I will say that this practice is sometimes mundane. Sometimes they don't share very inspirational things because they're in 7th and 8th grade, and that's okay. Sometimes they talk while other people are talking, and we stop and we practice and say we're waiting for respect. There have been moments where at the end of the day, the bell is rung and there are students still sitting in circle without having moved because they want to make sure that they hear everyone in the circle and what they have to hear. I have been able to be seen as a participant in this through my use of the talking piece. We've had students who want to sit on the floor. We've discussed birthdays. We've discussed the deaths of family members. We've discussed sporting events. All of these things go into culture and language and multicultural education. In the restorative justice book, one of the things they talk about is this ability to discuss these in-depth topics. These have happened in my classroom this year, especially in the way that I've been able to affirm students' languages. I had a student tell another to only speak English because they're in America. And so I was able to stop and discuss in circle about why we should affirm other students' languages and how that is an asset. And we've had conversations where I am more a facilitator rather than a questioner, which I think is really important to making sure that these students are able to have those conversations, whether they're learning English or whether they are learning more about these cultures. We had a conversation about the use of the N-word in a novel and how we'll approach that as a class and circle as well. It's encouraging that these restorative justice practices are making traction in many schools and districts, especially locally. At a school, this was from an article that took place in the middle of my research where they were using restorative practices and circles in the classrooms in order to go through conflicts, and that's been replacing in-school suspensions. Restorative justice practices were a response to zero tolerance policies in school. After Columbine events, in Vandering and Nevin's book, they discuss how that practice of zero tolerance in response to student behavior has been a huge foundation for the school to prison pipeline. And if we think about the inequality in our schools of different students of different racial backgrounds and language backgrounds and minorities, sometimes that imprisonment piece is a really strong piece of inequality. And so restorative practices are a direct response to that pipeline issue in a way that we can positively impact students before that happens. I believe the most vital piece to take from restorative practices in the classroom, besides the positive impact that it has had specifically on mine, on student voice and perception, is that it is a philosophy and a set of beliefs, and it's a paradigm change, exactly like multicultural education is. Like Nieto says, it is not fixed content and it's not a program, and I think that is crucial if we are going to implement it in our classrooms. In terms of credits, I would highly recommend people seek out the sources from EdUtopia, as it is going to give a wealth of knowledge and webinars for all of this information.